Thank you for tuning in to Circling Dialogos and my conversation with Christopher. More about that in a moment, but first some housekeeping. So if you're interested in circling, in a couple of weeks, the 30th and 31st, we will be having a weekend intensive, circling weekend intensive. Links for that and all of our courses below. If you're interested in working with me one-on-one, I am currently taking clients. You can go ahead and email me. Email address is in the show notes. All right, so it's been a little while since I've had a video conversation with Christopher, but as always, in every conversation I have with him, it's deeply insightful, deeply soul-making, I would say. And I love my connection with him, and I love there's just so much to say about my affinity for Chris, and what's come out of the relationship with him and John and so many other people. But this one, we go deep into this sense of what do we mean when we say world? Especially in those moments where you hear so many people talking about making the world a better place, or saving the world, or that the world is falling apart, or where our notion of the world has become something that is kind of almost unquestioned. But so we go deeper into that, which leads us into talking about the logos, talking about having an account of the world, talking about Plato and Socrates, and virtue and virtues themselves. So this conversation goes really, really deep, and also I would say broad, but definitely soulful. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy. Actually, it's welcome back. It's been a little while since we've been on.
It has.
Yeah. I get questions about you, probably more than anyone else, about when's Chris coming back? Or when are we going to start the Plato, the Plato dialogues again, and those kinds of things. So it's good to have you back.
That's nice. That's really nice. I've been getting some of those questions about the reading the Plato dialogues as well.
Yeah.
But it becomes harder and harder to wedge it in with the sheer abundance of things going on.
Right. Totally. Yeah, totally. We were talking about this kind of sense. I think, how do I put, I don't even know if I can formulate it right, but there is almost an unquestioned, at least in the circles I run in, or the part of things that catches my attention, of people saying things about the world and making it better, or saving it, or right at the context of just like where the world needs to be better, it needs to be saved, it needs to be boom, 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 boom. And it's funny, it's like I'm willing to bet that any level of abstraction closer down to concrete level, anything that you say about what's going on in the world, and like say, don't you want to make that better? If you come it down a level of abstraction, I'm sure that almost every problem that you present to me, I'll be like, no, I want to make that better. Right? Like I want to make, like, do you want to like clean up the plastics in the river and da, 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 da. Well, that seems like a problem that we could do something about, it's ontologically viable to get a grip on as a problem. However, there's this other word that people use, and it's so interesting how it's unquestioned. It's kind of like how in with COVID, it was unquestioned about loot, like where physical survival was the was it was unquestionably the thing
Yeah.
to count the most, right? And it's not, I wouldn't say that I agree or disagree with that, right? But that it was unquestioned, right?
Yeah, that it was obvious.
Yeah. Even while we had like a president, if anything, he could have, you know, if anyone was capable of like saying the most awful grunty thing, it's him. It was him. And he didn't even question it, right? Like, so it's there's something around that level of it where there's like this kind of background sense about the world, and we need to make the world better, and we need to save the world, and this kind of thing. And people use it kind of like this to where you almost don't even hear it anymore, or it's just assumed that yeah, it's, there's something in me that kind of wants to say something like the unquestioned factor in that is exemplary of the very illusion that may be.
Right.
Something like that. Right. So we were just basically talking about that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, because it's the thing that you look through without seeing, right? Like that level of presupposition is invisible to you. It's invisible to us, all of us, right? Because we all have it in some way. Becoming conscious
very
of it is
like
the great
world,
past, right? Pardon?
It's very much like the phenomena of the world.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
In some sense.
That's right. And
we see things in the world, but when we try to look for the world itself, it's nothing we can point to.
No.
Mm-hmm.
No. The sort of the kind of the ineffable totality. But then at that point, the world becomes the same as the self, right? Like at that level of resolution, if it's the sum total of marginal scaffolding that frames the world, then the entirety of it beyond the frame is whether we think of it as oneself or as the world. I think that the two concepts ultimately they retract together at some point, right? Totally. Because it's still the sum total of everything that is propping up and otherwise framing what we're doing and seeing. That is not in and of itself being seen or done with in any sense, right? You can't, right? John likes to say you can't frame your framing. Right. So yeah, but it's those, like, it's hard to get at that. Like, it's really, really hard to get at that. It's one of the things we've been given now is an opportunity to get at that because of how severely shaken people are. Right? That's what I mean. It's sort of, that's the kairos, right? Because it's only with a certain, it's only when everything quakes. It's fear and trembling, right? Mm-hmm. And it's only with the fear and trembling do those invisible structures, right? And that's the idea of the Pathologos, right? The Grimes idea of the Pathologos is that it's a belief, or I think probably a better way of thinking about it is an entire way of believing that grows out of perhaps one particular belief that is caught and molded and becomes equivalent at some point with one of the most fundamental axioms that we use to then stack up other kinds of premises. And that core worldview, that core kind of, that core way of knowing or way of believing that we acquire surreptitiously under the radar in a moment of vulnerability, or in a moment.
What you wrote about in your article.
Right. Yeah. And in a moment, this is how Grimes describes it, right? In a moment of unsuspecting intimacy, right? Those very conditions that can give rise to, right, that we talk about so often in Dialogos, those same conditions of intimacy and of novelty, of the unexpected and unbidden as it emerges, those same kind of conditions can produce what he calls this pathologos, right? Which is the false belief or the sick belief, or that acquired view of oneself and of situations that immediately begin to circumscribe what is possible within a number of, begin to circumscribe what's possible in a person's relationships and a person's life and whatnot. And that you catch it without necessarily knowing that you've caught it. Yeah. Because it kind of steals upon you in a moment where maybe you're disposed in such a way to be a little bit more vulnerable to it, and it steals over you and it becomes part of the way that it's sort of like, I would have sometimes sort of this embarrassing experience of learning a word and hearing a word. Tell me if this has happened to you. It hasn't happened in this context. It may have happened in another. There's a word, and you're maybe you're younger, and you hear that word in conversation, and you read its context.
Yeah,
and that word becomes part of your vocabulary.
Yeah,
whatever it happens to be. And then after that conversation, you begin to use it. You use it, because at one particular moment in your life, that word became a remarkably useful instrument. And it seemed to somehow, it had a certain way of gripping.
Yes.
You felt gripped by it, and it had a certain way of gripping the word. And because of how uncanny and useful it was in that situation, you adopt it. And then you use it again, and you use it again, and you use it again over the course of time. And you use it always presuming that its meaning is identical to the meaning that you apprehended in that moment when you were first exposed to it.
Right.
And then suddenly, years later, I've had this experience. It's very humbling. You realize that word doesn't mean what you actually thought it meant. Right.
Right. Totally.
You say it one day and someone goes, "What?"
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Totally.
I don't think that means what you think it means, or I don't understand how you're using that.
Yeah.
Or what do you,
like masturbation isn't just mean religious solitude.
Does it not?
I think I don't even know with what words you're talking, but I just know the experience that you're talking about, right?
Me neither.
Yeah.
And so there's this moment of abrupt disillusionment when you go like, oh my God, I acquired something as part of my vocabulary very early, and I've been brandishing it and using it and sort of wielding it as an implement all this time. And then there comes a moment when I realize that actually the thing I've been using, not the thing I thought I've been using. And it's actually been reflecting on me in ways I've been oblivious to all this time.
Yeah.
And the idea of the Pathological, I think, is very similar insofar as it's something that is acquired without full knowledge of its scope of implication, or what other effects it will have, right? What beliefs will be piled on top of it, such that it will become a foundation for an entire world of thinking and presuming that depends on that belief.
Or meaning the thing that you thought it meant.
That it depends on that word meaning what you thought it meant. Exactly. And one after another, we're heaping more and more experience on this one instance of misframing that has significant consequences beyond itself. And usually, for when Grimes describes this, usually he describes it happening sort of within the family matrix.
Yeah.
Thinking of yourself in a certain way relative to your fundamental relationships.
Yeah.
Because it becomes a matter of identity, right?
Yeah.
It's not something can't be a pathologic belief without also being a belief about yourself that is fundamental.
Right.
Because the belief about yourself fundamental, and the belief that's directed to the world are ultimately directed to the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So I think that one of the characteristics of that pathologic belief is that it is a belief of oneself first, that naturally means it is also a belief about one's relationships and how they resound out, and ultimately how they return feedback, right?
Yeah.
And so we all have these, these blurred,
little tweaky.
Yeah. That's the idea. And some of them are small and perhaps a bit more innocuous, but some of them are very, very big.
Yeah.
And
when we find out that on that thing, my wanting to know that was inaccurate, if a lot's sitting on top of that inaccuracy, if it's, man, I'm not going to, there's going to be a part of me that just does not want that to be true.
Right.
I will need that word to mean what I thought it meant. Right. If everything's banking on it, right?
Right. That's right. So back to your point about health, and maybe it's kind of, and it's a radical thing to say, right? Because it's saying that a person's health and physical well-being is paramount is not it's like a perfectly reasonable thing to say. It's not as though it's a ridiculous statement. Totally. It's just, but it's it's a mark of how difficult it is to object to, that it can become, I think, that it can become a pathologic belief insofar as it becomes we acquire a sense of its essentialism without that essentialism having been subject to a logos of argumentation such that it could possibly be doubted in the first place. And it's not, the point isn't, right? The point then of the disillusionment isn't trying to tear that idea down as a concept, but to try and realize that it has been made essential before its time, right?
Totally. To take it up with logos again. In some sense, this is one of the things I appreciated about was it Jordan Peterson's, because he's been talking about Dialogos. I think he was on Rogan talking about Dialogos, and where his way of speaking about it, he says, you and I are going along, and like something starts to open up, and I throw a few words on it, and you throw a few words on it, and it moves around, and like you say something that's not quite it, what he saw it as, what that does is that like old worn out ideas fall away, right? And it refreshes your perceptions. Right. I think that was a really interesting, like, way he highlights that, this way that conversations, right, when they kind of go into Dialogos, one of the most immediate things that you notice the impact of those conversations is the thing that you were talking about looks really different to you by the end of that conversation. In fact, not only that, but you have new eyes in some sense, where it's not just there, but you can start to see a deeper pattern everywhere, right? And it's that that dying, refreshing aspect of it that is linked to the very structures of perception. And if you think that's like the structures of perception, as Gregory Bateson pointed out, perception and behavior are completely coupled, right? So if I have a shift in how I perceive, that changes the way the world occurs for me, and all of my actions, internal and external, are in correlation with that occurrence, right? So I think what I'm hearing you say in that way, it's like you're not saying like, oh, therefore what we need to do is go, fuck this idea of like health being number one. That's not the point, right? It's more has anyone noticed that it doesn't occur at all reasonable to even notice that we're valuing that, with the sense that it could be another way, right? Like we can't even question it. That is the thing, is to go, what is that? How come? Like, let's open, look at it and all this kind of stuff, because certainly for sure, you go to Middle Ages, but it's that thing about physical health being a priority, right? It's by no means a historical constant. It hasn't always been self-evident that that's the case. In fact, if you look at most religious traditions, they kind of prophesize, right, that like, no, actually, there is so much more important than just your physical persistence, right?
Absolutely.
So it's kind of like that just went unquestioned. Is just I think it's telling of not that idea, but our ideas about ideas and the way that we behold ideas and question kind of our own assumptions, and notice that as part of this greater thing that I think we're talking about now, which is like, it's just self-evident that there's a world, and to be a good person, you need to make it a better place.
Right.
Something like that. We're like, what is that? You see, do you smell something there? There's something stinky going on.
It's funny. You don't smell it until you leave the room, and then you come back into the room.
That's it.
Then you smell it.
You
smell it. And then that's getting to the idea of ideas in Dialogos. I think because for so long it was understood to be some kind of clinical, intellectual form of some kind of form of intellectual sterilization.
Yeah.
But of course, as we know, as you and I know, having done this and been trying to practice it, it's anything but. It's quite the opposite. It's trying to get outside the cone, right? To of all of those presuppositions,
right,
of things that are thought absolute,
right,
and it's trying to duck under and around that kind of presupposition, to get outside of it just long enough to be able to go back to it with inquiry, with curiosity. It's almost like trying to renew. It's about renewing wonder, but it's also just about renewing a curiosity of those things that, because they went unquestioned, went without curiosity.
Yeah.
Right. And how going back in time with health is a useful way to do that, because you're right. I mean, before we could control it, and before we had as remarkably well developed a facility with health and medicine as we do now, perhaps before we had so much to lose, I guess one could say. Yeah. It was a lot easier to put it among a shifting hierarchy of values as opposed to placing it at the top. Yeah. It's just, I suppose, a peculiarity of this time for all kinds of reasons that we do that so automatically. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that getting back to the idea of ideas is to prevent any one of those subsidiary ideas from mistaking itself as the idea of ideas, yes. Right? No idea gets to be the idea of ideas. The minute it conceives itself that way, it's no longer any such thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Absolutely.
Then I think it's inflated. The minute something becomes the idea to govern all of other ideas, that's when it becomes ideological. That's when because none of those ideas per se, or none of those virtues or values, it's not like the project is not to somehow deprive them of their value or deprive them of value in general, right? That would be in the most negative sense of the term, that would be a nihilistic project.
Yeah.
And I think that this dialogic one isn't in that sense, right? It's instead trying to displace whatever idea had been mistaken that day for the idea of ideas.
Yeah.
And to achieve some kind of contact with, as you put it, the gathering logos that is properly known, not known in any particular way, but known only outside of its propositional form as the
Yeah.
idea that moves ideas.
Right.
You know?
Right. I in some sense, I think we're making a distinction about something I've been thinking about, which is the logos. In some sense, there's this part of the, well, one, I think it has to do with this way that the logos, and especially having logos, like being a being that is with logos, right? There's this element in Russin talks a lot about this, right? Where in his most recent book on the Republic that he wrote, which is really good. What I'm kind of getting out of it is he's emphasizing this part of logos, which is it's ambiguity, ambivalence, right? In that that you can't be a human being without having an account going. You're going to have an account of reality. You're going to have an account of anything that is at all intelligible. Because you have logos, you will have an account. And I have a sense about this of and essentially philosophy, right, in some sense is about, well, how do you account for things well? Because you're going to have an account, right? And so it's not given that your account is going to be good. It's not going to be healthy. It's not, and if you don't have an account, which he translates logos, he emphasizes the part of it that's like to take account of something, to have an account of something, which he goes into the history of the Greeks, and at that time, right, like city state, they're kind of leaving they're kind of leaving the feudal system or whatever was they were doing before the having the states and republics, and they're realizing, like, in this kind of democratic system, and in between these two things, how important logos is, and that you can have an account, right? Say, he uses this example where it's, as you get bigger in size, you need to protect the city, right? So that's a distinction, right? That's an account, right? Like, okay, we need to, and whereas before everyone was part of the military, right? But as you get bigger, you need to have a military. So you create a military. Makes sense. It's like directly related to the need. But then all of a sudden, that very account can have a life of its own. Then the military can that's there to meet the needs of the cities, for the prosperity of the city and the protection of the city. It can then take over the city and use the city, right? There's all these ways that it can mess up, right? So like a lot of the Republic, John Russin's kind of highlighting this kind of way where logos is this huge responsibility, right, that you need to have, because you can have accounts that completely eat your own lunch. Right.
So it's like you have to somehow be, your knowledge of something as it grows in complexity. Not even knowledge is a tricky way of putting it, because it's such an equivocal term, right? But let's say the model that you have introjected and that remains working and alive within you, of a thing as complex as a city, has to be kind of dynamically coupled to the unfolding nature of the thing itself, in order for that internal model to be functional enough to make the kind of decisions that you need to make, that have something that complex as their subject. Right. And so it's like it's your connection to the unfolding nature of that complex city that gives you attention to so that He's following the tradition of having logos be the kind of the intelligible arrangement of that particular nature, right?
Yeah.
The logos of the
Yeah,
city.
totally.
Is that right?
Totally. And my also sense is that there is a distinction between the order that the logos creates, right? There's the dynamic of the logos that in some sense unfolds things, right? And gathers things newly.
Right.
But then at some point the logos could kind of leave and you still have these structures of the logos, right? There's the kind of the living dynamic of the logos, right? And which I think is Dialogos in some sense tries to stay right on that line of like the felt living dynamic in which you feel in reverence of it, right? But also still having propositions and still kind of like noticing the form and getting as clear as possible and updating those things. And like this, it's this sweet spot that I think that implicitly we're trying to hit with Dialogos, which is it's in some sense, it mimics logos in some way, but it is possible for, the structures that at one point were directly in relation with what was happening, right? And living, just like that example of, an army at that time. So it's the most essential thing, but at some point that account can lose touch with its original source and then take over the city, right? That kind of thing.
Right.
In some sense, right?
Right. So, okay, this is interesting. So there's the logos where it's the problem with this term, right? Because it's so rich and it accounts for so much. And when it comes to accounting for itself, it becomes very, very, very tricky, right? You and I were texting recently a lot with John about how the logos in the Heraclitan sense is something that we're so very, very, very tempted just to identify with a kind of Platonic eidos. And the distinction between those concepts becomes very, very, very fine. It was very, very equivocal, very tricky to
very hard to tease those two out. But we're talking about, this relationship between those two may be key to what we're addressing right now or coming to right now.
So.
Right?
I think so. Because you're talking about the logos of the logos as the kind of as the intelligible structure of a given thing or a given system, like the example of the city or the example of the army, right? Where there's the quote, the structural functional organization, the thing that somehow coheres and prevails above its component parts to make it what it is, to self-identify. It is the relation of that thing to itself. In some sense, it's logos, right? And yet we're also talking about the logos as something more, as a dynamic of spirit. We're talking about logos as spirit, I think, and also in a different way, right? Which is to say, the kind of that centripetal force that is operating within Dialogos that gathers together the various perspectives that are being ultimately stereoscoped and opens the space for the yet unacquired perspective to present itself as both an amalgam of what's been proffered, but as something that's ultimately fundamentally more than the amalgam of what's being proffered. And so it's the sort of like compounding spirit of compounding insight that's gathering together, consolidating what's going on, and then turning it in such a way as to turning it in a metanoetic way, right? And so understanding the relationship between these different formulations I think that one of the it's very difficult, because one of the things that makes it so difficult to use logos, it's so tempting to use logos in precisely that equivocal fashion, because there's this intuitive sense, at least I have, I think you have it too, there's this intuitive sense that there's a continuity of nature and identity in the logos, whether it is ascribing to the specificity of a particular arrangement, or whether we're thinking of it as that verbal force that is actually arranging our attention in real time in communion with other people.
Yes.
And that there's a continuity of concept between the intelligibility that has us contact a particular phenomenon as to allow us to know it from within, like knowing a city from within by somehow having an apprehension of the logos of a place.
Right.
But also allowing that particular spirit its due when it's actually a creative force of emerging realization between people, and somehow there's a continuity between those two things, because they both have to do with the intelligible contact with the unfolding of something.
Totally. There's something I want to there's a thing I want to read that I think I'm realizing what struck me about this in this conversation. It's the first. It's just this one little paragraph that Heidegger opens this book. It's called Basic Questions, I think, and you could say it's like some, it kind of marks this turn Heidegger makes after being in time. This is kind of the book that kind of marks that in some sense. It's this one paragraph where he says, it's the very opening of it. He says, basic questions of philosophy, quote unquote. That's the name of the lecture. Basic questions of philosophy. That seems to imply there is such a thing as philosophy in itself, from whose domain basic questions could be drawn out. But such is not the case and cannot be. On the contrary, it is only the very asking of the basic questions that first determines what philosophy is. I'm going to read that part again. It is only the very asking of the basic questions that first determines what philosophy is. Since that is so, we need to indicate in advance how philosophy will reveal itself when we question, i.e., if we invest everything without exception, in this questioning and do not merely act as if we are questioning while still believing we possess our reputed truths. I think he's really kind of getting at this. And like what he's saying is that what I hear him saying is there's no domain of truth out there established that we can kind of stand over and against and like speculate about. And he says, and I think he's kind of pointing to like so much of what we think about as thinking is that. But what he's saying is like, no, philosophy isn't until the question that philosophy is of itself is asked, right? Mm. And that you have to ask it with your whole fucking being, right? You can't just, and in some sense, I think that this is kind of harkens to the thing that we're talking about, where there is this tendency where like, and I think this is what you're talking about too, that you were referring to with words, when words become a cemented meaning. And then you go through time and then you realize that word did not mean what you originally thought it was. It was slightly off, right? But then embarrassingly you realize it. But then if you build a whole world based on that misapprehension, to learn that is quite a commitment, right? To learn otherwise. but there is this way that like ideas and frames can become perniciously thing-like, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thing-like. And there's something about when it becomes thing-like and enough thing-like that we stand over and against it. And our very standing over and against it establishes it as it is and us as us. And then any amount of thinking about it perpetuates that very thing because, right? So I think what he's basically saying is like, so if you really ask it, it means it's a very different kind of address.
It means you're constantly unthreading what is being threaded through, right?
Yes.
It's a constant negation. It's this a constant emptying, right? Was it kenosis? A radical, constant radical emptying.
Yes.
And in a way, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because if that we're in a situation that you've just described, where we've predicated a world of beliefs upon a word that has been misapprehended by analogy, right? Then our relationship to that foundation becomes ethical, right? Like the thingness of the frame, I think that you've described, the thingness, because think about the health thing again, right? Think about the incontrovertible thingness of the knowledge that it is supreme as a value.
Yes.
That creates an ethos, right? An ethical framework that feeds back around that. So that one belief, that one belief taken as essential produces an ethic of conduct from within itself. And that ethic of conduct can be obeyed very, very, very dutifully, because if we take the foundation of that belief to be what is most real, most apparently real, then we leave ourselves no choice but to be dutiful toward it, right? And I think that's why when we talk about the religious as a state of orientation, as a state of knowing, the reason that it's graduated from the ethical, right? At least in that, like I'm thinking of the Kierkegaardian tradition again, but one of the reasons that faith is graduated from the ethical, the religious is graduated from the ethical, is because it has implicit to itself the fear and trembling that happens when we turn ourselves toward the absurd and come upon the realization that whatever ethic it is we are so beholden to is not as essential as we believed it to be. Doesn't mean it has to be like it doesn't mean that it had no merit and it had no value and it has no place among the world. But what it does mean is that it is not the absolute that we took it to be, and that whatever the absolute is, it is phenomenologically absurd to us because we simply can't compass it, right? We can't acquire the absolute in a way that we can acquire a particular ethic when that ethic is based upon a foundation that is ultimately the thingness of something that it was never any such thing at all.
Yes. Right.
And the realizing that it was never any such thing at all is the graduation into the real absurdity.
And that's
right. That's the unraveling as you ravel, right?
Yeah. That's the threat.
That's the threat.
Or the perceived threat.
Or that, well, it's a threat, but it's also a necessity, right? It is threatening. And I think that's the problem. It's both threatening, but also necessary.
Yeah.
And how do you square that?
I think we maybe like feel that necessity, and because we don't know that word means something slightly different than it actually does. We feel the necessity and we funnel it through reification of the very thing, that thing, like, right? That sense.
That's right.
I mean,
that's right. And then we become more and more then in a way we become more and more alienated from ourselves, because we become alienated from everything about us that would be unlocked and allowed if that one belief were to be undermined.
Yeah.
But as long as that one belief is not undermined, we live within a very, very fixed horizon.
There's
right. It's like putting yourself into a corner of yourself.
Yeah.
Right. It's like having a room it's like having a home of many rooms and living in just one of them. Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because I'm hearing it's so interesting how this stuff kind of just comes back. But in some of these conversations. Well, so John, I've been hearing John kind of talk about this dialectical tension between what he's describing as a hermeneutics of suspicion and a hermeneutics of beauty.
Yeah.
And so right now we are in these Dialogos practice videos that I've been doing. We just did the first one, and the first one was on reverence.
I haven't seen it yet. How did it go?
Oh, it was great. It was great. Yeah. I'm like the intent in doing that is to mostly listen to joining practice and like refine it. And so like come join us anytime. Like
totally. Anytime. I will.
It's every Thursday at 10, I think was when we do it.
Yeah.
But reverence is really interesting because in some sense, there's the reverence, like is the opposite of reverence isn't irreverence. The opposite of reverence is hubris, is arrogance, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Which is interesting to me. Like, so there's something about, right? There's something about that reverence seems to be that thing that like exemplifies and maybe helps situate this thing where between like the hermeneutics of suspicion and the hermeneutics of beauty, right? Because I think when you just have the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? And John's been talking about it like you could say some of the extreme versions of postmodernism, they've been doing nothing but questioning fucking everything in some sense.
Yeah.
Right. But that is, I mean, that's led into extreme versions. That's just led to exemplifying like they've done a good job of exemplifying the bankruptcy of spirit, right? In some sense, I think that like some of the extreme versions of that kind of enacts that out, but it doesn't notice that when you deconstruct something or you are suspicious of something and you see the truth and you go, ha, I knew it, or whatever, it doesn't realize that that's banking on the sense of that there's something that's actually true. It's not just deception, right? That there's something from which you can be deceived of. What is that something? And if you lose that, right? If you lose that, so I'm kind of getting this sense where reverence has this quality about of humility, right? When you're the one with the virtue of reference, it's like you see something, right, in its beauty, in its power, in it, whatever it is, and you see it and you find yourself the proper relationship to it. Is it shows you the difference between you and it in a way that has you in some sense move towards it, but yet at the same time in moving towards it, finding your own right size with it. But in this way that you want, it's like reverence is that way where you don't want to be it, right? On some level, but you do want to be it, but you know that you aren't it. And you know that there's like even the frames that you're seeing that you can't even, you're constantly, it'll like whatever it is that you're reverent of will constantly blow out the frame from which you can see it. Thus this humility that comes in. So I'm just kind of getting this sense of like where a bit of what we're talking about is seems super important to question in a way, right? That in some way holds true to the virtue of reverence, such that we can be suspicious and notice, like see our own blind spots and attempt to see our own blind spots and all of our corruption and all of the stuff, right? But in that sense that having that somehow reveal and the beauty of things, right? The something worth revering. So there's this, I'm feeling that dialogue going on in this while we're talking about reverence.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, let me make sure I understand you properly. I think I do. So that what you're saying is that
I'm not sure what I'm saying. So let's see.
Okay, let's see. So that reverence and irreverence, and I think it's a very good point. Reverence and irreverence have a kind of they are aspectualizations of the same fundamental attitude, which is to say that they have a dialectical relationship. They're opposites only insofar as they're dialectical opposites, meaning one begets the other, and in some sense there's a dependency between them, as opposed to because they both acknowledge somehow, or they both seem to imply an acknowledgement of something that is of an object that is either to be revered or whose, because even when we're irreverent towards something, we're irreverent usually. It's out of recognition for the stakes that we are irreverent. So both reverence and irreverence contain the same fundamental attitude toward the gravity of the object of reverence. And whereas something more like what you've said about hubris, or thinking that we can make something subject to ourselves and subject to our thinking, is what reduces it and makes it something concrete that can then be tamed. But something whose gravity or whose stakes exceed us very clearly, or exceed our capacity to tame it, becomes an object of reverence or irreverence, right? That's why you can have reverence toward not simply something religious, but you can have reverence towards something that is immensely volatile and powerful, precisely because is right, like an animal, for instance, right? Like working with a horse or something, you have a certain amount of reverence for the horse. And even when you're irreverent toward the horse, there's a sense in which you're throwing up your hands to the fated volatility of what it is that you have before you. And so if you're going to give up your sense of care, you're giving it up still remaining oriented to the proper consequence of giving
usually
it up.
Coming with like a wink. You give it up with a wink to the
right, as opposed to handling the horse and having no reverence for it because you think you have it utterly within your control. Whereas you might be reverent toward it, understanding that, boy, you don't. And you might be irreverent toward it because the sheer recognition of those stakes is enough to imbue you with a kind of reckless form of humility that makes you irreverent.
Right.
I think about that with humor a lot of the time. Because irreverent humor is one of the most powerful ways of attending to the sacred, right? Like that's why comedians that are knowingly very irreverent, I find very worthy of admiration, because it's precisely because of by being attentive to the sacred that they can be so irreverent, right? It's usually a sign of deep attention to be knowingly irreverent. And it reminds me of the distinction between the way that you brought this in about how the opposite of reverence is not irreverence, but is something like hubris. It reminds me of the lying, bullshitting distinction, right? That the opposite of being truthful is not being knowingly, consciously deceptive, because both being truthful and being knowingly deceptive involve a relationship or a fundamental orientation to what is true. Even if we don't have it apprehended, we still have to somehow defer to it if we're going to deliberately subvert it.
Yeah.
But bullshit, obviously, bullshit is different from both, because bullshit is an absence of that care and concern and orientation in the first place that would lead us even to have contact with such an idea, right?
Right.
And so that sounds like very much the same distinction that you're making.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it is. And there's that, yeah. And I think maybe, part of the things about the hermeneutics of beauty, right? There's something in some sense that is there in advance, right? You could say that I even have the ability to be reverent, right, to something. Because in some way there's something structurally or originally in us, right, that's already in some sense capable of an orientation to moreness, basically, in such a way that our sense of moreness in some sense has us closer to what we revere, right? Yet that closeness also reveals my own imperfection in relationship to it, right?
That's right.
It's this something about that where it reveals this paradoxical thing about us, right? And being, right. And in some sense, if you think about it from the standpoint of the one who's revered, it's interesting because you can imagine if I take their position and let's just say, what I'm seeing is somebody just totally being revered towards me, right? And let's just say that it's like 100%. I see somebody coming towards me, but yet also, in some sense, willingly being more right size. But if at a certain point, I'm going to end up revering them, right? It's like there's a way where it goes around. So there's this element of it where it's not just the person who's revering the thing, but there's a way in which the thing gets something from that very reverence, right? So much so that if it's like there is this sense of where the reverer, right, if they fully revere, you end up with, in some sense, it's a reciprocal opening of both.
Right. Because because then you, as the revered, let's say, if you, guysengstock, were to be the object of reverence, which I'm sure you have been, then ultimately what then becomes your object of reverence is the reverence itself that reflects the more of you in the eyes of the person who is doing the revering. Totally. And then what you're revering is not yourself, but you're revering the attitude of reverence that refers itself to something in you and about you that is more than you in the first place.
Yeah. So it goes. So you start to have reverence for their ability to enjoy you, to
revere,
to whatever, and that's the right way to receive that.
That's right.
I think it's the only way to really receive that.
It is the only way. It is the only way.
What to
other
get?
Than
their giving is their receiving, and my receiving is getting their giving. Like in some cool thing that happens. It's probably why it's a virtue,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
In that
because
way.
you'd have to realize that their reverence was directed toward that you would have to know the proper, or have a sense that the proper object of the reverence was something that had to be allowed to come into that. There was something that it's something that's not yet present between you.
Yeah.
And that the fact that it is being so revered might allow it to become present.
Yeah.
Because unless you mistook yourself, like your most basic identity, for the object of that reverence, which isn't a mistake that you would make, but it is a mistake that many people would make, that would foreclose its power and foreclose its possibility right away, as opposed to entering into a practice of appreciating the reverence, so as to sniff out what its proper object really is, because it's not obvious what it's because the object of the reverence is the experience that is occurring between the two of you, right? In that case, you're not the object of reverence. The object of reverence is whatever is presenting in the relationship and is finding a home in your reflection,
right?
Right?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And it's because if you just, from the standpoint of like somebody revering you, let's say, and you're the one that's being revered, to try to like, it's mostly like, it's, you got to, in some sense, notice. You got to notice that what's giving that gift, and that you're really getting them, right? In some sense, right? And in getting them, in some sense, you do get a sight of what you are to them, right? In a way that can have you actually appreciate what you're doing and shine light on what you're doing that you didn't see before, right?
Right.
But it's not exactly. It's not this. There's something about the. If you try to say that is like they're a claim to your identity of some kind, and confirmation of your identity of some side, you'll either just get so inflated, or you'll just become so self-conscious that you can't even tolerate it, right? And that's why acknowledgments are a practice, right? Like it's one of the things we do in our courses is we literally practice giving acknowledgments and appreciations to in some sense to work out that weird, awkward thing that comes up with that, as the one who's receiving the appreciation and the one giving. Because there is a level, there is something really vulnerable about when you really, really do deeply revere someone, and or revere something, some talent that they have, or something that you admire, and you really are express that as an acknowledgement of that being the case. There's a level of vulnerability that comes from that's like sharing your deep appreciation that's really exposing in some level, right? It's really exposing. To both. Even
who do you
more
think
so, it's even more, I would say it's like, and I've heard other people say this too, it's almost more vulnerable in some ways than if you share like this secret thing that you feel super bad about yourself, right? Like that's what usually people like think about. What scares them with vulnerability is like, oh, I'm going to show you the thing I'm really insecure about, or I'm going to show you like this way that I'm not totally a good person, or I'm going to show you this kind of thing. And that's really scary. But there's something about when I show you that the depth of how much I love you, or I show you how much you mean to me, or in some deep acknowledgement that's a really, I would even say somehow there's a vulnerability that can be even deeper than the one where you're kind of giving, you're showing your underbelly.
Who in that situation, who incurs the most responsibility to dispose that vulnerability properly in that interaction? Is it the one who is giving the reverence or the admiration, or is it the person who's receiving it? Because both positions are,
it's a battle for both. Yeah, it's in a different way.
It really is, isn't it? Because being on the receiving end of something like that is, I mean, to offer it up, I suppose you've offered it up. I mean, you've gone ahead and you've done it. And such things, there's such power in giving something like that, that there's almost a sense of economy that has to be observed about it too, right? And I think it's tricky to find that sense of economy. It's tricky to find like to find the kairos, right? What's the best time? Because we can say things that are approximately true about how we feel. But in a sense, part of this is one thing I think I've come to learn, is that one thing that is also a part of saying something true, part and parcel of its particular truth, is finding a time when it is most true, and when that particular expression of truth can find itself in relationship with what is ultimate, or absolute. And you can, I don't want to say waste, but you can take something that's true and miss that kairos with it. I know I've done that. It always feels tough when you want to. There's something that you need. There's something that has something we might call the logos that needs to be coaxed forward by an admission, by disclosure. And what you want to do with disclosure is you want to find the right time for that disclosure, so as to coax forth its corresponding target. It's corresponding, the thing that it is trying to feel out and reveal, that it could coax forward by admitting of itself. And you want to find the right way to do it. But sometimes it's hard to find the right way to do it. And sometimes you try and it doesn't quite work. It's like entering into dialogo. It's like entering into dialectic, and it never quite takes traction and becomes dialogos. And so then that's the responsibility on the part of the discloser, the part of the reverer, and then on the part of the person who's receiving it. That's a remarkably difficult thing to do, both with grace, so that you pick it up such that you don't leave it to gutter out. It's important not to leave something like that to sputter out and disappear, because it's something of great value. And yet you have to figure out what to do with it and how to turn it so that it becomes an instrument for disclosure in yourself and in general. And as the receiver of a something like that.
Totally. And it's kind of so like,
it seems to me there's another obligation or another sense of responsibility on the part of the person who receives that. But it's more difficult, I think, to define. What do you think about that? Like, what do you think? Maybe responsibility isn't, maybe that's not the right phrase for it. I'm not sure. Maybe that's not the right word. But do you know what I mean?
There's so much finesse that to me is being disclosed about this, is that there's things about timing, there's things about the place that you stand, how you listen, like there's all kinds of things that go into this experience of, someone will say, being reverent in their acknowledgement of you and how they've impacted you and what they see in you that calls forth the reverence, and then sharing it with you, right? That there's probably not going to be, which I don't think there is, a list of rules that if you follow them, that'll be it. That there's something else going on, that that I think is exemplifying of perhaps reverence itself in this way, where it's like you come close to what you revere by also, right?
Of course.
In that sense, there's something going on in the very dynamic, which seems to be there's a verticality that you're acknowledging.
Okay.
That when you work it out horizontally, it's hard to see the whole thing in terms of sequences, because it's expressing a verticality that in some senses prefigures it. But the question I have for you is, wouldn't you say that in some sense, if virtue itself were a virtue, I think it would be reverence? Because in that way that virtues, they speak to something aspirational that isn't yet they, in some sense, grant the normativity for somebody who you aren't right now, right?
Yeah,
This kind of quality of there's something that uncapturable about a virtue, right? That educes beyond you, but yet creates the normativity that affords you to be the person that you aren't in this moment, but it leaps forward. And in some sense, why I say that is because that sounds very much like what's happening in virtue, but in a very direct way. Or I mean, in reverence, in a very direct way. That sense of, beyond yet, kind of something like that. Do you get what I'm saying?
I think so. The
structure of virtue itself is, I think, what, in some sense, reverence enacts, right? But in a more direct way than maybe the other virtues. I'm not sure. But it's one thing. Here's the thing: is if we think about it like this, kind of back to what we were originally talking about. It seems one of the things that's so. I saw this. I actually saw this. This really struck me. Right when Russia, in the first, I think, week or so, maybe 2 weeks of Russia, when they attacked and they were reporting it, it started to make itself known that the Ukrainians were impressively defending themselves, right? And as that started to come in, there were a few days there where I was watching the newscasters talk about being inspired by that. But there was a strange thing where they were genuinely inspired by that. And were kind of like, had this sense of like, I can't believe that I'm actually really inspired by something right now. Like there's this extra thing where there was this period where it was living, where they weren't just saying it as some ideological kind of thing that they're supposed to say, or some position that they're coming from, right, that they're trying to enforce or something like that. There was a genuine sense of like, I can't believe I'm saying this, but they're actually, I'm really inspired by that, right? And this surprise that that's happening, that I'm actually looking at the news and I'm genuinely inspired by the human spirit of what's happening here. And then a few days later, they're saying the same thing, but it's clearly like already inside of a frame of Western ideology and all that.
The crackle of authenticity is gone.
But
there was that moment.
That little moment, right, of being surprised that I'm like, life has reached in and touched me at a level that's like beyond conceptual, right? And that I'm having that experience, right? Reverence, right? Genuine reverence. It seems like we are in a time where probably that's the thing that's, I think, missing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because in so many ways, when people are expressing reverence, there's so much bullshit about it, right? There's like some kind of agenda in the background that's not being totally said. It's kind of, there's a certain kind of a fake reverence that comes out in this intensity, but it's not real true reverence. And there was that moment, like, I think, where I saw like the world broke in and they found themselves genuinely reverent of the human spirit, right? That went beyond, what, and the surprise that was there, right, for them. Strikes me as like, there's something about the way our time, and I think this is probably what nihilism is. I mean, this is all the stuff about nihilism, right? About, we can't really find the place to be genuinely struck by something in such a way that we find ourselves in genuine reverence within, right?
Yeah.
That sense of things.
Yeah. And almost changing or being changed around it, or reforming around it.
Yeah.
As though because what it does is it gives us a kind of imperative for where to put our attention, right? Reverence.
Yeah.
Immediately.
Yeah.
Like, it gives us that without the intervening,
yeah,
all of those sort of intervening criteria or heuristics that we use to determine where to put ourselves at any given moment, right? Reverence seems to bypasses all of that. It becomes a criterion of attention by itself.
Right.
And it leaves us in no doubt as to what we must do.
Right.
And that's the hermeneutics of beauty, I think, right? Yeah. That's where John brings up the statue of Apollo, the Rilke poem, right? You must change your life. That there's that being so struck with reverence means that you cannot remain, right? You can't remain. You have to bend yourself around the object of reverence. Yeah. Now that's the imperative within the moment. It doesn't mean that that's what you do. It doesn't mean that people did that necessarily when they had that fit of admiration for the Ukrainians or whatnot. But you're sort of seized by that, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's what you mean. Maybe that's what you mean about how if there was a virtue of virtue, because it's self-effusive, right? It's like it has a relationship to itself that when you become implicated in the relationship that the virtue has with itself, that virtue becomes your identity too.
Yeah, totally.
It becomes you.
And it's this experience of discontingency, right? It's this, it's an experience of, I've hit something that's something like ultimate, that's something like isn't a conditioned and determined,
right?
But like
that's right. And that's why it can lay waste to an ethic, right?
Yeah.
That's why reverence can smash an ethic, because an ethic is contingent. An ethic has rules. An ethic is coded. Right. And what we're talking about is something that's a code breaker in some sense, right? It basically dissolves those other, or it can, if it's powerful enough, I think, what it can do. I mean, there are literally people who, your example is a very fitting one, because there are people from all over the world who signed up
to go fight.
To fight with the Ukrainians, right?
Yeah.
And that, what could that possibly be but a religious experience,
Right.
that calls people to do that, right?
Yes.
What else could it possibly be but a religious experience that calls people to do that?
Yes.
And not pronouncing upon it, obviously, in any way, but the phenomenon of it, the what else could make somebody do something like that, right? And it goes back to the health argument too, right? It's not a very healthful decision to make.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
To go and fight in the Ukraine, in Ukraine.
Yeah.
But that moment of reverence would prevail over an ethic that had health as its founding principle.
Yeah.
It wouldn't take long for that to be undone, would it?
And I want to say now, whatever that is, that thing that touches, breaks open ethics, that discontingency, right? Is something like that, is something like that's the world, right? It's like that's the world. Like it's the thing about like it's the thing that I am. It's already underway by the time, and articulating the one that's noticing that is underway. It's like there's something about that's the world, right? And I think when we talk about like let's make the world a better place, right? And it's not said with reverence. It's like in some sense we're taking the world in this, and you're making it our subject, right? Mm-hmm. I think is what you said earlier. And so just kind of bringing it back down to the very thing that we were talking about,
right? Instead of finding ourselves subject.
Yeah.
That's right. And because usually when that phrase is employed, to save the world, usually it involves an ethic.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Usually it involves an ethic. Usually it involves the imposition of a form, with constraints and governing principles and actions and that kind of thing. And what we're talking about is the kind of experience that penetrates through those kinds of scaffolds.
Totally.
And becomes the criterion around which we reshape our thought and our action very, very spontaneously, right?
Yeah.
That's why virtue wouldn't rely on that would make it a good candidate for your proposal, and it's a virtue of virtues, because if it's a virtue of virtues, then it allows for the reorganization of virtue within us, and it allows us to renegotiate our relationship to the various virtues, because it forces us to reconsider who we are in relation to them.
Totally.
And that would prevent other virtues from becoming unduly inflated or thought absolute, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. That's what would allow us to make, the unhealthy decision, even if we were beholden to the idea that we had to be as health conscious as possible.
Yeah, totally.
Right.
Totally. Yeah. So there's this element of just, this kind of being, and there's a participatory element with it, right? And in some senses, I think the Dialogos project, right? That's why it's like, we're not saying like, hey, the world needs to talk to each other like this more or something. No. And that's not it.
No, it's not it. You're right. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
No,
not it. It's not prescriptive in that sense. It's more like there is a very ancient experience that by getting close to whatever it is that forms Dialogos when it happens, that it's the getting close to it in an intimate sense of the word. It's being like that there's something in that conformity, right, that goes beyond prescriptions of things, right? It's like, it's not useful in that sense. It's in some sense getting a living sense of in touchness with what is of ultimate concern, right?
Yeah.
In some sense, right? And being struck by it, being formed by it, being like in that sense, such that when you go out and you live your life, there's a sense of just that starts to become more and more organizing, right? Of your perceptions.
That's right. I think that's, you put it perfectly. It's like you're just trying to trace out the pattern as much as possible.
Yeah.
Just trace out a pattern. It's like playing the same beautiful piece of music over and over and over again. And I think to me, that's what we're doing in doing Dialogos. And it's just playing. I mean, that's why the musical metaphors, that's why they abound so much when we're talking about this, right? Because it's just about patterns. It's just about the patterns. It has nothing to do with what we're saying, except insofar as what we're saying as a way of conducting the pattern.
Yeah.
But we're just trying to conduct
patterns
the pattern
as such, right? Yeah.
Patterns as such, and developing a relationship between speaking and showing forth.
Yeah.
Closing that alienating gap between the speaking of and the showing it forth.
Yes.
And just like, to go back to that example about the reverence and disclosing the reverence to someone, maybe that's really the criteria, and that's the answer, isn't it? As well, when should you disclose such a thing, and how should you receive it? Well, you should receive it or disclose it, as the case may be, in accordance with what would be most reverential, right? Accordance with the very nature of the virtue itself that is being evidenced. And because there's that same faithful idea that by speaking it into the right kind of ear, in the right kind of way, with the right intentionality, with the right show of faith, that the speaking it can actually summon it, can actually presence it, can actually coax it forth. And normally it doesn't. Normally it can't. We say things all the time without ever showing them forth, without ever bringing them into the center. But I think that's what we're trying to do in this case, is we're trying to use the speaking of things using the speaking of virtue in the matrix of philia and of all the faithfulness that comes with that matrix of philia, in order that the speaking of may be a showing of, may be a becoming of.
Yeah, totally. And a finding yourself in genuine reverence, right? And in some sense, it's part of this whole quality of like this way reverence reveals both a sense of perfection and your own imperfection at the same time. Right?
Yeah. Both.
Right? Yeah, both of those.
So
good talking with you, my friend. It's been way too long.
It really has. It's always great talking with you.
Yeah.
But thank you.
It's always like homecoming.
Thanks for pulling me back into your world. I always enjoy being in it.
Yeah, me too. All right, brother, I got to get going.
You got it. Okay, we'll chat again soon.
Bye.
Thanks, brother. Bye.